Welcome to another episode of Coach's Corner. With me, as always, Paul O'Neid. What's going on, buddy? How are you doing?
Doing great, man. Doing great.
Fantastic. And with us today, special guest, Stuart Locke or Stu Locke. I don't know which one you prefer.
Most people call me Stu.
Anyone call you Stewie?
My dad, which is
I will now.
27.
That's definitely one of those if I want to demean you, I can go Stewie because that's like bringing you down to, and that's probably why your dad calls you that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Nice. So Stuart is a power lifter himself, but he's also running the barbell course for Prescript and is a coach. And like I said, a good power lifter. I'm not sure what your best total is, but it's either over 2,000 or close to 2,000, correct?
Yeah. So no, last time I competed was like June of 2018. Came into the meet with like a pretty bad back injury. Squatted 716 in sleeves, benched 424, and then pulled like 716 or something.
It was 720, 722.
So close to 2K.
Yeah. And then I did an off-season rehab from that, tore my left quad, tried to rehab from that, tore my right quad. And so, yeah, I've just had a laundry list of injuries from not moving perfectly from playing a lot of sports for a long time. And that's where I'm at. So I'm healthy now. So we'll see.
So you've had a plethora of injuries and you teach a course from a group that prevents injuries. Seems kind of contradictory.
Do as I say, not as I do. Right.
That's
and so
Paul,
like
that's what Paul told me about you.
Yep, exactly. But like, I mean, it presents a really interesting problem because Stuart's he came into strength sports from a very deep athletic background. Like he played football at the university level. He played rugby at the university level. He played these sports for
Canadian university level.
Yeah. So
okay, so
like
that's
high
like,
school or like middle school. Yeah. But like a lot of the injuries that he came into strength sports with were like he fractured his scapula and you dislocated your shoulder, didn't you?
Yeah, like tore all of the muscles around my shoulder and then dislocated my shoulder and then fractured my scapula.
So like that injury and then like hamstring tear, ankle injuries. So these all affected his ability. Like I've been working with Stu off and on for the last 5 years. And when you're dealing with that many movement deficiencies that can't be fixed, right? You can't fix a broken scapula that didn't heal.
Says you.
Well,
you may not be capable of doing that, but
I'm not a surgeon.
I'm sure there's plenty of coaches that will throw their hat in the ring being like, I could probably fix that scapula, no problem.
Yeah, for sure. Just a couple overhead band distractions.
Good to go.
Yeah. It reminds me a lot of Steve Gentili. Steve played college football and had a plethora of injuries through that. And then also he has that kidney disease that also could be causing some of his injuries, but he was plagued by injuries as well. And throughout his whole lifting career could never stay healthy. And probably a lot of that has to do with not even playing sports at a high level, but just playing contact sports for an extended period of time, right? That's going to create, even though it's not necessarily what I would consider a deficient sport, unless you're playing maybe like defensive end where you only have one side down at a time, or you're not big enough to play tackle. So I
played tackle.
Okay, so in Canada you play tackle at 270, but
yeah,
here in America we like our tackles to be over 300 pounds and athletic.
Our field is also 10 yards wider and 20 yards longer.
That sounds so stupid.
It's pretty
awful.
That's like a rugby. I mean, rugby. I don't know if they are longer or bigger, but
when I played soccer pitch,
when I played rugby, it felt like a lot. It felt like a lot more running, and it felt like
it's a fucking lot more running. It's awful.
Yeah, especially when you start, because you think like you don't think about your lane assignments. You just think like, oh, where the ball is, that's where I go every single time. So when I first started playing rugby, I was like, oh, it's over here. I'm running over there. Then, oh, it's back over here. I was exhausted. I was like 5 minutes into the game. I'm like, I feel like the fattest piece of crap ever because I can't catch it. And then as you get better at it, you learn like, oh, well, this is my assignment in the field. So as long as the ball doesn't come my way, I don't have to necessarily blitz over to the other side every time. Then I felt a little bit better, but I was still It was a very cardio demanding sport, and I was not prepared for that.
Yeah.
Because when you play at the college level, when it's like a club sport, you're only practicing like twice a week, not really taking it that seriously. And then you get on the field and you're like, fuck, I should have taken this a lot more seriously.
Oh, dude, we played the defending Division I national champs in 2014, Kutztown University. They're from Pennsylvania. So their 8-man had like played U20 for South Africa. Their entire back line was from American Samoa. And I was like I physically was fine to match up against any of them, because like in 2014, like my last season rugby was about 245, maybe 250. Yeah. But like I remember like watching our fullback get like, he tried to come in like off the edge of a ruck and like hit one of their pods, and he, like their 8-man just knocked him unconscious. And I was like, well, we're playing a different game.
Yeah. There's a big difference between real rugby versus like what we think is rugby, especially in America. Although America they're becoming a little bit better at rugby. They're still, I mean, you watch the All Blacks play. No offense, I don't know if that's even a name that can be said now, but you watch the All Blacks play in New Zealand, and it's like, man, they're just on a different level. Like that's the cream of the crop for them, much like the NFL is the cream of the crop for us. You got guys like Johnny Lamu, who was getting scouted by the NFL, who was running like a 4.4 40 at 270 pounds. It's like, how do you even do that in the open field? It's a scary proposition.
And he played fucking sevens, which is even harder.
Right. So much more field, so much more speed. Yeah, I love watching rugby, man. It's a fun sport, and I'm glad that a lot more people, they're bringing sevens to America too. I know New Zealand was here not too long ago when they had a sevens tournament, so it'd be cool to catch them in a game. I always wanted to go to New Zealand and watch them play a game, maybe against like Australia or like South Africa, one of those bigger places. But
that'd be fucking awesome.
Yeah. So Paul, is this rugby talk over your head?
No. I was
what sports did you play?
I played basketball my first year at university, and then I played football for 2 years, but just like club bullshit football.
Okay, they had club football at university?
No, it was junior football. So it's usually guys who were after high school but haven't qualified for university yet, trying to get scouted.
Okay, so kind of like semi-pro-ish.
Yeah, similar. But it was like it was a joke. I played 1 season, and I didn't really have the opportunity to learn the sport very well. I was just quite athletic coming from basketball, and then I had knee surgery for the first time, and then just couldn't really get back to it.
Knee surgery because of sport, or knee surgery because, okay.
Yeah.
And that's kind of when it all started escalating, all your knee problems?
No, I was pretty good for a while. The first injury was like on the field. I went to cut, and my foot just stayed where it was. I tore my lateral meniscus in my right leg, and it was during that rehab process that I actually really started falling in love with strength and conditioning, and like the science behind it and the movement aspect. And that's really what started me off to be a strength coach. And from there, I didn't have another knee surgery. I think that was 2003. I didn't have another knee surgery till 2015.
Okay. Yeah. So not really symptomatic of it. Yeah. What got you into lifting? It's always interesting to hear how people got into the coaching side of things. A lot of it is very much similar to what you said, where you got an injury and then something kind of just drove you to start learning about it. What about you, Stu?
So I played football in high school, obviously, and then like grade 11 season, I had a very, very good season, but I just like couldn't get off the blocks. Like if someone caught me, I'd be fucked. And I was like, this is fucking dumb. Like I'm just getting manhandled. And so I was like, I guess I got to lift weights. And so I ran Westside Barbell for Skinny Bastards and took to it like a fish to water. Like I'm pretty sure I started the off season at like 160. By the next spring, I was like 205, and I was like, oh, this is sick. And then I just continued from there. Like by the time I came into training camp in first year, I was like 230. And then just became obsessed with it. Like I would watch all the old, I would read all the old T Nation articles, like watch all the Elite FTS videos that were on YouTube at the time. And then just continued from there. Like I was able to when I was on the rugby team, like I was responsible for our strength and conditioning programming. So that was kind of like my first interaction with training people in person. That was like 2014 was the first year they let me do it. And then like the defensive coordinator that we had on the football team was like also super into it. His name was Devin Murphy. And so, yeah, just like chatting with him, and then it became a passion of mine. And then when I graduated, I started training people in person at a big box gym here in Canada.
Nice. And so being an athlete and having that background in athletics, why not go the strength and conditioning route instead of kind of the personal training route?
Honestly, it was the first job that I applied for at a school, and I got an interview, and then I got the job, and I was like, guess this is what I'm doing. And then, I mean, I was there for 3.5 years, and like, it was a pretty good career. I mean, like, it allowed me to buy a house and like, do a lot of things that I wouldn't have had a chance to otherwise. Like by the end, I was part of the PT education department for the whole company. And like, I did in-person seminars, like education for all the trainers, and like put together the periodization template that they now use in 400 clubs across Canada. So it gave me a ton of really cool opportunities, and it padded my resume quite a bit. So yeah, it was literally just because it was the first job I got.
Yeah,
that's not bad. I will say, like in the Canadian inter-university sport, like the ability to go from even student to strength coach, there's just zero opportunity. Out of, Stu, there's what, 15, 17 OUA schools?
It maybe 12 or 14.
Okay, so out of 14 schools within our conference, only 7 had full-time strength coaches. And of those 7, 5 were also the GMs for the campus rec.
Okay, yeah.
There's just no funding for like collegiate strength coaches. I was the first one at the school that I was at. They didn't have one before me.
Yeah.
So interesting. And a lot of schools actually up here will contract out to private sector companies to do their strength and conditioning.
Okay. Yeah. Very interesting. I would have never guessed that, but I also haven't really heard other than like hockey sports being very big in Canada.
Volleyball is very big. Basketball is coming up as well. But all of our basketball players go to the States for university.
Yeah.
So
interesting. Okay. So Stuart wanted to come on, or Paul wanted to invite Stu on because we had a bit of a back and forth, and Instagram is definitely not the greatest place to express ideas and share creative thought processes. But we went back and forth, and you had a little bit of a bone to pick with me saying something about specificity. So go ahead and kind of just start off with what you found to be wrong with my post, and then kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So
yeah,
essentially the post, in so much as I can remember, is that basically if we look at the literature says that like variation isn't really necessary in order to develop strength, and then it kind of went on from there. And my point of contention with that is, one, we know that strength is a very easy neurological adaptation to invoke, right? It's not particularly tough to get strong, but it is quite easy to get injured. So, that's where variation in exercise does come in, because it allows us to still train that quality, maybe through an underloaded variation, but also train ourselves in positions that we may not experience during the competition squat, bench press, and deadlift, right? So we know during, even in the barbell bench press, and the barbell back squat, and the barbell deadlift, we're in a pretty like extension biased posture, right? And there's certain tissues that are overloaded through being in that pattern. And, if we consistently run through those patterns and we have really any sport history coming into it, oftentimes we'll end up with either overuse injuries or like weird soft tissue injuries like hernias. And that was essentially my point, right? Is like variation is not really necessary if you have someone coming into the sport with no training history, no sport history, no pre-existing injuries, right? But they're essentially a virgin body. But how many people do you train, Tony, and how many people do you train, Paul, that come into the sport like that? I mean, the number is very, very small.
Yeah, very, very small. So Then is this idea of variation being a driver of, lack of injuries? Is that something that you've correlated throughout the years, or is that something that you've seen kind of backed by the literature as well? Because you made the point, and it's a very good point, that the science is usually anywhere from 5 to 10 years behind what the actual coaches are doing. So, in order to be a great evidence-based practitioner, you have to look at what the current coaches are doing with success and combine that with the literature, and then also combine that with what your athletes are telling you as far as feedback mechanisms go. So the idea of variation being a driver for injury prevention, to me, it just seems like a very nuanced concept that doesn't have a lot of back into it. It seems like that's just what people say, and there's nothing that they can concretely point out that this is what has been shown time and time again, that variation is a great driver of fatigue reduction and lack of injuries.
Yeah. So I think, you look at it from two perspectives. One is that I think it is a very nuanced topic, because you have to be able to delineate between tested and untested lifters. And then you have to be able to delineate between lifters with a training history and a sport history, and lifters without a training history or a sport history. And so, when you look at, let's say, untested lifters with a sport history, or tested lifters with a sport history, I mean, there's not really any literature on that at all, really, right? It's like, it's all in like college age males with 2 to 5 years training experience. That's not the cohort that any of us are really talking about. And like, in that cohort, yes, I think variation is probably unnecessary, but very few if any of our clients are going to be like that. But a lot of the literature that we can look at that is supportive of the idea of variation is multi-sport athletes versus single sport athletes, right? And so you look at all the literature that looks at single sport and multi-sport athletes in high school. Single sport athletes are typically the ones with the most injuries, and single sport athletes are typically the ones that burn out earliest. Whereas multi-sport athletes are not only recruited at a higher rate, they have less injuries, and their athletic performance, for whatever reason, seems to have a higher ceiling. And so, from a literature perspective, I think that is something that we can look to say, okay, just in terms of movement variability, it seems like moving through multiple planes, possibly playing multiple sports is beneficial in terms of injury prevention. But when it comes to experience, or when it comes to literature specifically with powerlifting, I don't know that any exists with what we're talking about.
Yeah. So then if there's no literature, then it has to go down to anecdotal experience, right? And I don't know. I think it's a far stretch to pull that literature on multi-sport athletes and single sport athletes and compare that to powerlifting, in the sense that, right, one-dimensional athletic ability we see this all the time, like baseball players, they've played baseball their entire life, they've never really experienced other sports. They're more prone to injuries because there is some overuse criteria there. There could be something with the shoulder, there could be something with the elbow that causes a lot of high school pitchers to kind of gas out really soon. So being able to maybe play multiple sports throughout the year can alleviate some of that fatigue and stress. But you're saying that the variation within the movement patterns is going to be variations with bar movements, or variations within exercise selections, right? If you're thinking about how can I create variations that's not going to create overuse injuries, that would be correlational to multi-sport athletes, you would be thinking, okay, well, my power lifter who does back squats, now we're going to do side lunges, and now we're going to do overhead squats, and now we're going to do things that challenge you in different planes of motion. I think would be more similar to extrapolate from the multi-sport single sport than it would be to say, we're going to do back squats, and then we're going to do front squats, and then we're going to do safety squat bar squats. And those are the variations. So when you're saying variations, can you kind of explain what you mean by that concept in terms of reducing fatigue and in terms of managing injury? Because that's your biggest complaint, right? Is that without variation and you're just specificity year round, you're going to have a higher increase of injury rate. Is that okay?
Yeah. And so I think, when it comes to, squat, bench press, and then deadlift variations, obviously they're all going to be kind of like bilateral, sagittal. But I think, variation, we also need to think about kind of this extension-based posture that we arrive in, through the competition, squat, bench press, and deadlift. And so how do we engender any kind of movement variability with that? It's like, okay, well, we just squat not an extension, and then we bench press like not in a huge arch, and then we deadlift like not in a huge amount of extension. And then when it comes to intelligently programming accessory exercises, getting out of that, right? Doing more rotational things, and going more unilateral, and having the ability to express, strength through more than just, feet flat on the ground or shoulder blades back and down on the bench. And it's more so, it's just a tissue recovery thing, right? Is, the stronger you get, the longer it takes, not necessarily the muscles to recover, but the longer it takes kind of the structure, right? It's like at some point, like you are overstressing, your thoracolumbar fascia, and like that's principally avascular tissue. Like it's not going to recover super, super quickly. And if every week we're going through and we're stressing that structure and stressing that structure and stressing that structure, and the stronger we get, we're going to have these like weird things happen. And I think more than anything, and something that a lot of people lose sight of the fact is, variation is also very important just from an enjoying training perspective, right? Is, the lack of variation in the high specificity model is very common in the USAPL. What else is very common in the USAPL? Lifter burnout, right? You have these guys, they come into the scene, will total 2,100 pounds as a junior, and then 2 years later, they're gone. Why? Because it's really tiring to squat 6 days a week. It's really tiring to bench 6 days a week. It's really tiring to deadlift 3 days a week, all in the competition variation, right? At that point, training just becomes a slog and it becomes boring. And so, variation gives us the ability to kind of expose ourselves to ranges that we're not exposed to through the squat, bench press, and deadlift, or competition squat, bench press, and deadlift. And then it also gives us essentially movement capital, so that, let's say, for instance, we get into a bad position in a squat. If we've trained that bad position through another exercise, it gives us the ability to control it, and then by extension would reduce the risk of injury in that position, because we trained it at least in some capacity through another exercise.
Right. And that's one of the arguments that Louis Simmons makes why conjugate can be such a successful implementation for powerlifters, is that you're training things through different ranges of motion and in different positions, and getting really strong in those positions so that you can overcome any type of lack of technical efficiency within your movement. And my argument would be, well, if you just practice the movement more, then you're going to be technically proficient at it. So where those compensation patterns won't necessarily present themselves, because, right, my argument is that specificity within movement patterns, and also specificity within load and volume criteria, is something that should be looked at more often when it comes to exercise selection and programming, right? People say periodization, but I don't think any coach really do periodization anymore. They just do programming, periodized programming. So I think, well, if we can train, if the understanding that I have is that higher volume training is going to lead to more fatigue. However you define fatigue, there's no real great definition for that in the literature, especially from a biochemical standpoint. But then it also, higher volume tends to lead to more central nervous system fatigue as well, which all that stuff can be highly debated. But we know that when people usually go through higher volume blocks, that's when the volume, the load becomes greater than the actual ability for your muscles to compensate those patterns, right? And that's when fatigue creates injuries. So I think, well, if we can keep things very specific within those movement patterns, then we're not going to, accumulate a lot of fatigue, because we're not going to be pressing things to such a high volume standard and closer to failure to where that's going to be a problem. And then two, if you have appropriate exercise selections outside of those main movements, and as you say, you're in the off season, you may do a couple singles or doubles with a squat, and then the rest of your program is built towards fixing those compensation patterns so that you don't have to worry about the overextension. You can do a lot of those things within those. So I think that the accessories and the proper exercise selection will allow you to train specific more often year round. And it's just more or less a load volume and a volume management than it is anything else, right? So in the off season, you may be doing 1 or 2 singles a week at those main movements. And then everything else, 80% of your other lifts are going to be more built upon accessories to help strengthen those movement patterns in the different planes. So doing lunges, doing single leg work, single arm work, things like that. And then as you get closer to the meet, the volume tends to go more towards the specificity movements, and knowing that you've put in enough work in the off season to build up any of those compensation patterns or asymmetries or imbalances, then you're able to push that a little bit more. Where I think a lot of people, they'll use variations for the sake of variation within their program. And one, because it allows their lifters, they'll preach to them overuse injuries. And then their lifters are going to be like, okay, well, let's do SSV squats. And to me, it's like, just because you're manipulating the load a little bit from front to back doesn't necessarily mean that's going to not increase your ability to get injured, right? Because you're still breaking at the knees, you're still breaking at the hips. So you're still having the same use within those movement patterns. Just because load is going to be dispersed a little bit differently doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to alleviate some of that stress, some of that pain. And then when they get back under the bar for low bar, they're like, oh, my shoulders and elbows are fucked up because I haven't low bar squatted it. So now every time I low bar squat, I have this idea that my shoulders and elbows gets fucked up. And that's because they don't have the proper exercise selections throughout their off season to allow them to get into that position and own that position and not have those injuries, right? If you can have someone low bar squatting year round with lesser loads so that they're comfortable in that position and that they've accepted that range of motion, and then you can see some of those imbalances, then you can program accordingly to fix those imbalances. So when the volume and the load goes up, when you're getting ready for the meet, you're not going to have those injuries. So that's my idea and rationale behind specificity, is like, if you do that year round, one, you're going to be able to see progress on an incremental level, whether it be whatever your gauge of progress is. And two, you're going to be able to see those imbalances that specific lift curates for that person. And then through exercise selection, you're able to fix some of those things. So it's not necessarily deviating from the specificity of the movement. It's just kind of undulating that volume throughout the year, right?
Yeah. And I think, for me, the way I view it is the younger a lifter is in their training career, the more specificity that they are allowed. And the older a lifter is in their training career, the less specificity they're allowed. And the reason for that is simple. When you're young and when you're new to lifting, you're kind of motor retarded, right? Like, you're not particularly good at squatting.
I find that very offensive, first off.
Okay, I'm sorry. Word.
It's okay. In America, we find that word to be extremely offensive. I don't know how they are in Canada, but
noted. So
thank you.
They're not so good at squat, bench press, and deadlift. And so it makes sense to have a little bit more of your work devoted to teaching them how to low bar squat, teaching them how to competition bench press, and teaching them how to competition deadlift. That said, at some point, it's like riding a bike. You know how to do it. I mean, it takes you maybe 2 weeks to get back into the swing of things. And so I think that model does have a lot of value in younger training age lifters. I don't know, when played out over a long enough timeline, that model is particularly beneficial, right? It's like, for me, there are just certain things that happen when I low bar squat that I can't work my way around, right? It's like my low back blows up probably around week 3. And that's just a function of me being as strong as I am now, right? And like, I've tried a 1,000,001 things to get around it. I've gone to see my athletic therapist, but it's just like, I have a litany of injuries coming into it. And it's just like, my body at some point says, no, there's a check engine light on the dash. You're not allowed to do this anymore. And so, the longer a lifter's career goes on, the more often things like that happen. And variation is a means of still allowing them to develop strength, just without having those big issues come up, right? It's like, this left shoulder doesn't move. And so probably 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, I was trying to pull my elbows under in a high bar squat, and I ruptured the Osborne's fascia in my elbow. And then my ulnar nerve was just like plopping around inside of my elbow, and like my elbow would go numb and stuff. That's because I fractured my scapula and anteriorly dislocated the shoulder and then didn't get surgery on it. There's nothing that I can do to change that, right? I mean, it's like, I can go get surgery, but like, they're not going to repair my Osborne's fascia. And, we have to be conscious of the fact that having broad kind of prescriptive things to say with regards to like, oh, well, we have to have specificity at all points so we can understand that we have incremental progress, da, 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 da. Okay, yes, but there's a lot of situations in which that's not the case, right? It's like, I don't know many lifters with, a 2,000 pound or over 2,000 pound total who have had no serious career injuries, right? It's like, Paul tore his quad. I've torn both of my quads. I've exploded my back, right? And it's like, variation allows me to continue to train pain-free. And at the end of the day, it's the longer you can string together pain-free training and progress from lighter to heavier loads, the better. I don't necessarily know that has to occur within a competition squat, bench press, and deadlift in order for us to express that on the platform. Because there are plenty of examples in which that's not the case.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're going to chime in?
I would like to chime in.
Okay, go for it. But before you chime in,
yeah.
The only discontention I have with that is the idea of beginners being able to get away with it and then advanced lifters not being able to get away with it, when I know for a fact that a lot of the advanced lifters, like an Andre Milanichev, like an Eric Lillibridge, like a Dan Bell, all they do is specificity work. John Hack, all they do is specificity work, and none of them tend to get injured, right? And I think it more or less, in my mind, besides Andre, because he's like 50 years old now, so he's fucking shouldn't be lifting, but it's like a lot of it is just volume regulation. I think, to me, that's the biggest thing, right? You are a very nuanced case because you come in with injuries that just can't be worked around, right? Like you said you hurt your elbow by trying to squeeze into what you consider the perfect high bar position, right? So you force that position to be there. I'm saying that because of your injury, you had to force that, but most people don't have that. They don't have to force those things due to injuries that can't be fixed. They force those things due to shitty exercise selections and never challenging, right, the ranges of motion that should be challenged. They're always doing partial ranges of motion. They're always doing, they're lacking overhead stability. They're lacking overhead press. They're lacking single leg stuff through full ranges of motion. That's going to create more of their issues. So to me, I think that most lifters, as they get better, especially the good ones, they become more specific with their exercise selections because they don't want to waste a lot of time training exercises that aren't going to get them closer to that platform. Since we understand that neural drive is what creates the most for strength adaptations by far, at least double to almost triple, based on some of the literature that you look at, right? So that should be the driving force. You get neural drive and neural activation through specificity. So I think that would be my only discontention with that statement, is that there are a lot of really, really strong lifters that do specificity as they become more advanced because they don't want to waste time doing other things at a lesser weight, right? I mean, if you're doing a safety squat bar at 800 pounds, would you rather do that than back squat at 800 pounds? I feel like a lot of people would feel a little bit safer doing a back squat at 800 pounds than they would doing an SSB squat. And then what would the carryover be? What would the transfer be? And I think a lot of those lifters have found that to not be the case. As you get more advanced, you want to be more specific. But that was it. I just wanted to throw that out there. Go ahead, Paul.
So I think in what we've been saying, or what you've been saying, and I've been listening, there's a lot of agreement happening. Like we can all agree that to accumulate strength, it's a neurological stimulus, right? Neurological, which means strength is a skill, which has to be practiced. So in order to demonstrate the maximal amount of strength, you have to have the specific adaptation within that movement. We also know that bigger athletes tend to be stronger. So we have to accumulate tissue. In order to do that, we have to train with volume.
Bigger athletes are stronger. Yes, right? Overall, absolute strength. Yes. Right. But we see some of these smaller guys lifting weights that some of these bigger guys are lifting as well without the same amount of muscle tissue. And there's been a good amount of research. What? Can I finish? Because you're
sorry,
speaking.
I wasn't allowed to finish. So why should you?
Because you said that this week, what we all agree on. I don't agree with that. I agree that neuroadaptation is great. I just don't necessarily think hypertrophy and muscle size is as big of a contributor as we think it is. I don't think that if you look at the research, it shows that. There's some research that shows people were able to get bigger and not necessarily stronger. And then there's some research that shows there's a variance in strength between 2 to 20% in terms of hypertrophy correlating to being able to get stronger. So I don't necessarily think hypertrophy is as important as it should be. That's
Fair.
all I'm saying.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. It was just a piece of my argument anyway.
Well,
So strength is neurological. It's a skill and it has to be practiced. Variability can be accomplished within the competition movement. We can alter the intensity. We can alter the volume. We can alter the tempo. And then after we've done all of that stuff, then we can look at altering the load vector through barbell changes or whatever. Now, Stu's argument that we're taxing the same tissues or systems in a repetitive use manner. Well, yeah, that's how you get stronger. You need to tax the tissues repetitively to get them stronger. And we know that injuries from the research perspective is a overload to the tolerance of the tissues, and that could be chronic or acute. Now, variation would allow us to accumulate more volume because we're taxing different systems than the competition movement. And we'd be able to decrease the load on the tissues because most variations are underloaded, right? A safety bar is going to be harder than a squat for the most part.
Can you explain to me why you think variation will decrease the repetitive use of, like,
because you're changing the load vector, regardless of how, like, the load goes through the tissues in a different manner. Even if it's very subtle, it's still different.
And you think that's enough to dissipate injuries, that subtlety?
I never said that.
I thought that's what you were saying.
I didn't say anything about, I didn't say the word injury.
Okay.
I said it would allow us, we know that injuries happen because of an overload to the tolerance of the tissue, either acutely or chronically.
Right.
Okay. So I'm saying that we could use an underloaded variation to allow us to use a lower load with the same RPE. Okay. So we could accumulate volume in that manner. Now, variation does allow us to perform more volume with the different tissues being stressed in similar positions. So not the same, but similar. And we also have to know that we're not just introducing variation for the sake of introducing it. So there has to be some sort of dynamic correspondence. The reason I bring all this up is because the question shouldn't be, do we need to train specific all the time, or do we need to train with variations all the time? The question is, at what frequency do we need to introduce variation to allow the lifter to be pain-free and continue to progress their training? It's not an either or. It's as Tony mentioned, like, how much volume is attributed or how much work is attributed to specific versus general work. Because I do agree that if you want to get better at being in certain positions, you have to load those positions. And that is done effectively through the assistance work. So if we're just using variation to accommodate for shitty exercise selection, well, then you're not accomplishing the goal, because it will bite you in the ass. And the other thing, the test retest piece of, is the work that I'm doing correlating with the competition lift, which ultimately is the thing that I'm trying to get better at, right? So the question is, the question is not, is variation better than specificity? Because when it comes to strength, the answer is no. But
Did he freeze on you?
Yeah.
Gosh, what a cliffhanger.
Oh, he's
where
back.
did I leave off?
The most important part.
Oh, so will introducing some variation allow you to progress your training more consistently over time?
Right.
And
I just
that's why we use.
I don't necessarily believe that variation allows you to accrue higher volume for some specific reason. I just don't necessarily believe that's the case, right? If I can train 315 at a RPE 7 back squat, but then you're like, well, do 315 at a RPE 9-10 front squat, right? You're doing the same load, but you're able to train at a higher rate of intensity. I think that the idea that
I would use it for the opposite reason.
So you're
I would
saying
use it for
that,
the opposite reason. I would say like RPE 7 on both lifts, the load on the front squat's going to be lower.
okay, so that's fine. But then how does that lower load actually make someone stronger? And your idea is that lower load will allow you to accumulate more volume because you're training at the
Right.
same RPE, but you're training at a lower load. So the idea is to accumulate more volume. And I would have to argue that accumulation of
Right.
volume doesn't dictate your ability to get stronger. Accumulation of volume may dictate your ability to get bigger. Accumulation of load will dictate your
Okay.
ability to get stronger. So I don't necessarily think that
So then my
driving
question-
volume would be the biggest predicator of getting stronger. I think driving load is going to be the bigger predicate, because like I said, I don't necessarily believe that hypertrophy plays that big of a factor when it comes to actually getting stronger.
So then the question back to you is, should an athlete spend all year round focused exclusively on only getting stronger?
If that's their sport, that'd be like saying, should an athlete who plays football focus all year round on getting better at football, or should they spend a little bit of their time trying to get better at a different sport?
The reason I ask the question is, at some point, your neurological system, say it's a glass of water, for the car you're driving, you can only drive that car so fast, right? So if we spend all of our time trying to train that tip of the iceberg, right, that peak of the pyramid at the top, which is maximal strength, you can only build that pyramid as high as the pyramid is wide. So if we're always spending time training that peak, we will run out of space. You will. At some point, you have to devote time. And, regardless of what word you want to associate with it, whether it's GPP or off season or whatever, where the emphasis of your training should not be exclusively on displaying maximal strength. Because if it's displaying maximal strength, neurological adaptations happen really fast. Whereas biochemical, like hypertrophy, it takes a much longer time. So if you want to be the strongest athlete you can be, you have to have the base of that pyramid taken care of. And that does mean you might have to allocate your time away from training for maximal strength.
I would argue that you can train your competition lifts within that maximal strength paradigm of lower intensities, working your way up to higher intensities, and then build your foundation with your accessory work. I'm not a huge believer in building foundational movements through competition lifts. I don't think doing sets of
Me
8.
neither.
Right. So you can still train within that 1 to 5 rep paradigm. I'm not saying specificity has to be max out singles every single training session, but it should be trying to get as many singles in as you can within that training session that will elicit an adaptation, as long as you're equating for volume and load, right? And then you progress that, you wave that up and down throughout your training block, right? And hoping that, if you're doing the right accessories, then you're able to continue to progress and undulate the reps and the volume and the load a little bit each time, right? So if you're doing 3 sets of 5 and you just continue to add, say you do a block of 3 sets of 5 for 4 weeks, and you start at 70%, 75%, 80, 85%, and then you deload, and then you do your next block and you do the same thing, but you add 2.5 kilos to that bar, that's going to be better in producing strength adaptations than if you were doing 3 sets of 12, right? If volume was equated. So my point is saying that if you can do 5 singles or 5 triples, right, that's going to give you better adaptations and better strength gains than if you did 3 sets of 12 volume equated.
Yeah, but I wouldn't do that on a competition lift anyway. That's why I would use a variant.
I don't understand. Why
I
would
wouldn't
you
want to
use
mess with my pattern.
What's the difference between a safety squat bar for 3 sets of 12 and a back squat for 3 sets of 12?
Other than the fact that upper body is like completely taken out of the movement
In
the safety bar, because I can't use my lats to the same degree. I can't, right? It's a different load vector, much more forward. It's a variation. So you're getting you are altering, we'll call it a standard, like a 1 deviation would be the barbell. 2 deviations would be a tempo addition to the barbell. So like the question back I would have back for you is so you're talking about your main lift, which is fine. I don't disagree with you there at all. But when you go to your assistance lift, the question is like, how many deviations away from that competition lift do your assistance lifts go? Because personally, I don't do sets of, more than 6 for the most part on competition movements, because I don't want to see that technical degradation, because it's a skill and I want to practice that skill and stay true to that. But for a safety bar, like I'll throw my reps up higher. High bar squat, I'll throw my reps up higher, because it's not the same skill. So like, are you jumping straight from competition squat to like leg press?
No, but I wouldn't necessarily think if you're talking about internal stabilization, I would never push those to a higher rep range closer to failure. Because like you said, if we're technically becoming inefficient at these movements because we're in that higher rep range, that can have a possibility of leading to higher risk of injury as well. So I would think, well, when do people who have the most muscle train hypertrophy? And it's under external stability and when they can push things. So that's when I would think about hypertrophy driven mechanisms towards the end of the workout, if I thought that athlete would benefit from that. But I don't necessarily, based on what I've seen, right, with a lot of lifters getting very, very strong, doing specificity competition lifts year round, I just don't necessarily think that that's that important. I don't think that's that important.
So like, here's my issue with that, right? Is so like even Andre only ever powerlifted. And then eventually Andre's body started falling apart, right?
He was 40-something years old.
I know, but how many times in his last probably 10 years of competition did you see him deadlift with a knee wrap tied around his adductor? You know what I mean? Or like, he had to token his bench because he tore his pec again, or he had to token his squat because he tore his quad again, right? Like at some point along, along a timeline, those things stop working, right? It's like, even John Hack's the perfect example, right? Like, Dean Guido, like a friend of Paul and I's, like he went to an elite FTS camp with John, and like John never really played a ton of sports, right? Like, so his injuries coming into the sport were very low. And a lot of these people who come into the sport who have a very low or non-existent injury history, yes, they can do that. But you also don't use the exception to prove the rule. And you're also using a cohort to talk about another cohort, which isn't appropriate, right? It's like, okay, but look at all these people who are really strong and didn't have any pre-existing injuries coming into the sport. Okay, but that's not you, and then that's not Paul, and then that's not me. And so it's like, we have to have nuance in our conversation. We have to have nuance in our discussion, because it's just simply not appropriate in terms of like broad prescriptive analysis, right? Because very few people are in that position. It's like, you know what? If you come in with no injury history, yeah, sure, 100%. If you had drugs and you can push yourself pretty fucking far with specificity, especially if you're naturally gifted in terms of movement. But that's not every powerlifter. And in fact, like a lot of people that are drawn to untested powerlifting are drawn from other high level sports, meaning they'll come in with a history of injuries.
So it's like best case scenario, you train like Tony is espousing. But at some point, there's a cost benefit calculation to be done with, well, I need to get this work done, and consistent exposure to this movement continues to develop injuries or setbacks. At what point do you say, well, maybe I need to change something? Like, I'm curious, because I've seen programs you've written, so I know that you're not a hard and fast rule kind of guy.
Right.
But at some point there has to be a conversation of is the cost mean that of me sticking to my guns means that this guy can't train consistently over time? Or do I introduce some variability into his training and just decrease the frequency of exposure to the competition lift while keeping it in there?
Well, one, I don't like that you have access to my programs. First off, I have a very strict no compete clause with that type of stuff. So I'll need that person's name who shared that with you, and they will be fired as an athlete. So yeah, you're 100% correct, right? Like the talk is, for me, the talk is what is going to be the best way to train someone. The best way to train someone is so they're not injured all the time. If you're not injured, you're able to train at a higher capacity. My argument is that I don't necessarily believe that if you have competition lifts in year round, even if you're just greasing the groove with lighter weight, that's going to create injury. I don't think, in my opinion, and I don't know if it can be elucidated by any research, that variation will allow you to train and not have the same amount of injuries. I know.
Yeah, but now you're changing the argument, because you were talking about pushing the main movement all the time, and now you're talking about, oh yeah, just keep it in, just grease the groove.
And also, I think my point as an adjunct to that would be like, at some point it ceases to be of value, right? It's like, how much, like, first off, I know how to low bar squat, I know how to competition bench, I know how to deadlift, right? And you know, when you have higher level lifters, they all know how to do that. And it's like, Paul and even Tony, like, what fucking value does doing like 3 sets of 5 at 50% on low bar squat have to you? Nothing. All it does is it takes away from this kind of like, you know, this capital of energy that you have during a training session, and it takes it away from something that may have more value, right? And so it's just like, if by doing these competition movements, we're sucking out some energy that could be better allocated to maybe accessory exercises, then at that point, I would say that it's counterproductive. And you're doing it simply for the sake of doing it, as opposed to like what the lifter needs most. And I would argue that in a lot of high level lifters, practicing the low bar, competition bench, and then competition deadlift is not what they need most, because that's not what's going to unfuck them.
Right. And when I say grease, I agree with you, because I've wrote this up in our Coach's Corner stuff, that post-activation potentiation is bastardized by so many people. And people that have coaches that have athletes squat at like 3x3 at 60 or 70% before they deadlift, it's just stupid to me. And when I say grease in the groove, I don't mean at such a low percentages that you're not going to get any adaptation or skill acquisition out of it, right? The idea of skill acquisition is going to come with a certain load to where you have to respect it, and to where you have to continuously, like, if my rate of progression was 70% and that person was able to do 70% for a single at the beginning, and then they were able to do, say, 80% at the end of a block for a single, and it moved just as fast as that 70%, then I know that person got better at that competition lift, and they kept it in year round, or they kept it in within that entire training block, so that they're constantly able to hit something that allows them to develop that skill at a certain percentages that elicits adaptation. I agree with you. 50% is just a stupid thing to do. It's at a certain level to where they're going to have some type of training adaptation. It's not going to be put in just for the sake of it being put in. And my biggest discontention is that accessories can help prevent a lot of the overuse injuries that people say, right? And I think that if you're able to prevent those things within lifters that it's capable of doing, not that lifters that have such shitty injuries that like they can't do it, right? That would be an obviously workaround, right? You find things that allow the lifter to lift pain-free. I just think that you can lift pain-free year round with specificity, and that's going to drive the greatest adaptation to giving you a better total at the end of the day, if you're capable of doing that, right? And there's so many variables that go into that with the lifter, right? Like you said in the very beginning, they can get bored. And I would tell them, don't fucking pick a sport where all you're going to do is 3 lifts for the rest of your life, you know, because that you pick the most boring sport in the world. So, you know, and if they're injured, if they come with a history of injuries, that's going to be obviously looked at first and foremost. Those things are going to be looked at for sure. And all I'm saying is that if programmed appropriately, a lifter should be able to do competition lifts year round, and the accessories will be kind of the driving factor to keeping them injury free. And the volume and load is going to be something that you just wave throughout the year so that they don't have those fatigue. I think fatigue causes injuries more than overuse stuff causes injuries. I don't think patterns and overuse patterns are the biggest driver of injuries. I think fatigue, accumulation, and your inability to drive adaptation without just throwing a shit ton of volume at people is one of the biggest reasons people get injured. The chasing the volume is why people get injured more so than trying to have proper exercise selection, trying to create a program to where you're not chasing volume, but you can actually improve load without having to do 10 sets of fucking 5 on squats, right? If the end of your mesocycle looks like a 10x5 on squats, your programmer's a fucking idiot because he doesn't know how to drive adaptation, right? So I'm not saying that your far end of the spectrum should be so much to where all you do is squat, bench, and deadlift every day. I just think that a program done appropriately with proper volume and load management and then proper exercise selection should allow that lifter to train year round. And if they can do that, they're going to have a better total on the platform than someone who does variations and then only does the competition lifts at 12 weeks out. That's just my personal opinion. There's a lot of nuance to that.
Yeah, and I would 100% agree with you there. And I think something that we've all kind of glossed over up to this point is it also bases very heavily on the lifter's psychological profile, right? So yeah, Paul knows that he can't program any like heavy singles for me at all. Like even if it's like single at 7, nope, that's a 1 rep max. That is a new 1 rep max attempt because my brain does not work that way. Like if I see top set of 5 at RP8, that's a 5 rep max. Right. And so, and you know, it's, because I think there is a ton of value in consistent practice at relatively high intensities on lifts that people are scared with. I think that is beneficial. Right. And so, you know, Mike Tuchscherer always talks about like the single at 8 and then down work on bench, right? Because that consistent exposure to 90+%, right? Because a single at 8 is what, 92 to 94% or something. That consistent exposure to 90+% on bench press takes the psychological arousal out of the equation, right? Because they're hitting it weekly, maybe even multiple times a week, and they're not scared of it anymore, right? But and that'll happen with everyone on every lift. Like there's always going to be a lift that scares the shit out of you. I don't like, even with my history of injuries, like squat has never scared me. You know, bench has never scared me, but for me, like I fall apart above 90% on deadlifts. And it's not like a strength thing. I just like my brain turns off and I go full fucking ape mode and I can't do it. So based on your prescriptive kind of template, like me having maybe a little bit more consistent exposure to, you know, let's say relatively high intensity singles would be of value. But then obviously the inverse of that being how much of that can my body tolerate? Right. And it's like, for me, it's not very much, you know, like I fucking pulled that 725 and it flew. And then I went full monkey mode. Instead of just going to 750 and hitting a top single at 8, I was like, I'm gonna go 8 plates. And I went 8 plates and my fucking left hip and low back has been locked up since, because like my brain turns off and I'm just like, bah! So, you know, I think that model does have a ton of value. And I think it is very beneficial, especially when looking at a lifter's psychological profile, but it also has to be weighed against kind of the needs of the lifter. And, you know, oftentimes when we look at kind of long-term lifter development, I think earlier on, more of their time should be devoted to learning the movements and then also building tissue, just in terms of, you don't want to look like a fucking milk bag. But then later on, like it should be, you know, more of their stuff is then devoted to kind of injury prevention or injury amelioration of the stuff that they currently have. And that may mean less consistent exposure to, you know, 80% plus. And that's one way in which variations is very, very helpful, because it gives them something that has a high perceived intensity, but a low absolute intensity, right? It's like, all right, Paul gives me a top set of 5 on front squats at 8. Okay, 5 rep max on front squats. I'm not going to be able to do as much on that as I am on low bar, right? And then I'm going to fuck myself up less.
What do you got, Paul?
I have a question. So there's a commonly held notion, and it holds true quite well, that in order to get stronger, you have to do more, right? You have to increase the amount of work that you're doing, whether that's load or volume. You know, the discussion of how you display strength is we need to lift heavier weights over time. Then as you get stronger, because each repetition or set or training session is more taxing from an absolute level, it comes down to we're able to tolerate less. And that's why I think that's a big contributor to why strength levels off at some point. right? We get this immediate increase in strength because we're becoming more neurologically efficient, excuse me. And then over time, the rate at which we get stronger slows down. Now, keeping in mind that, we'll talk best case scenario, that we're training specifically year round. We have the competition lift in there. We're trying to drive strength. At what point do you weigh the option of if introducing variation allows you to train a relatively specific position more, could that be a way in which a more advanced lifter could continue more consistent progression?
Yeah, if I find that variation does have a one-to-one value to it,
right,
and the lifter cannot do the competition lift, then you would have to do next best case scenario, right? But my question would be more so as a coach, right? Finding a close variation, that's easy. Any monkey can do that.
Mm-hmm.
My question as a coach would be, well, why can't you do the main competition lift? And then how can I program it in a way that fixes that inability to do it, right? So if it's something like Stu has, where he's just fucked up.
No,
right?
okay. So I'm not talking about injury. I'm not talking about injury. I'm just talking about general like recovery from the work, right? Because it's going to be a lot harder to say the session is an RPE 8 session.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? 3 sets of 3, and your back squat, like for me, an RPE 8 session at 3 sets of 3 would be probably around like 600 pounds. But if I did that 3 sets of 3 at RPE 8 on a safety bar, it'd probably be closer to like 500, 520. So it's still the same relative exertion. Obviously, I've made the concession of load parameter, which means like I'm lifting 100 pounds less, but I'm doing it. I'm more likely to be able to recover from that 3x3 than I would from the higher load. Yeah. So that does, I personally believe that holds water in the argument for variation.
There's a possibility that the lower load could elicit greater fatigue as well. If that lift bends you over and your lower back is now fucked, right? So it just depends. There's a little bit more nuance to that. I think if that lifter is very technically skilled within the squat, meaning that like when they miss the squat, they just miss. They don't roll, they don't round over, they don't have any imbalances that causes them to miss. I think that you'd be able to have greater loads without eliciting the same amount of fatigue. Whereas if you have a variation that the person's not used to, that can cause a little bit more fatigue because the lift isn't as sound mechanically as it should be.
Okay. So to me, it's a cost. Like is the cost of the higher load,
right? Stimulus to fatigue,
right? Is the higher load or the poor positions? Which one is going to be harder to recover from?
Right. And that's going to be individual basis.
Absolutely.
Like Stu said, there's no research on advanced lifters. So it's all just anecdotal in what we see. Mm-hmm. And I definitely don't want it to come off as like black and white conversation. I just want to make sure that people have different concepts, right? Like I have my concept, Stu has his concept. Probably the best concept is somewhere in the middle, and we probably both agree on that. But it's like you have to be able to present your concept 100% on your side. But understand that, like, yeah, in a perfect world, my scenario probably fits best for people who won't ever get injured. In a least perfect world where people are fucked up coming in, Stu's probably scenario works the best. But you have to understand what that lifter needs and then be able to put that in place so that the biggest thing is if your lifter's injured, you're not getting fucking stronger. So your goal as a coach is to keep that lifter from being injured. And you have to find the best way to get them to their results without accruing a bunch of injuries along the way. Right. So if you can find ways to keep that lifter specific as possible without occurring a bunch of injuries, to me, I think that's the best approach. If you have to make adjustments to that because that lifter gets fucked up or they can't recover, right? Is it good to have a training stimulus to where they have to deload every 2 weeks? No. It's fine. If you can put a variation in there that allows them to get stronger so they can deload every 4 weeks, I think that's going to be better. But in a perfect world, I think that specificity is going to be the biggest driver. And then as a coach, you just have to implement that in a certain variation as far as load, volume, frequency that allows that lifter to be able to recover. But there should be nuances and conceptual ideology that allows you to call audibles whenever you need to. So I think that's why the conversation is important, because if Stu just came on and was like, yeah, no, what you said, I just agree with. I'm like, well, that's okay. Well, no one has any idea of like any other ways of thinking. So that's kind of the whole basis of it. But yeah, there's a lot of nuance to it, right? And I think that you just have to understand all those different dynamics to build out a successful program.
It changes over
And I
time.
think, yeah, and I think something that's also like, this is just something that like, because I mean, like really, like my first powerlifting coach was no one special, and then I started with Paul like September of 2016.
Oh, so Paul's special, and your other guy you just shit on. Cool.
Well, he's just
make sure you send me his name, and I'll tag him in the post so he knows.
Okay, yeah,
he's enormous and really scary.
He's way more jacked than Paul.
Wow.
But it's like because what I've come to realize is like, because like at points in my coaching career, like I've gone really down the fucking variation rabbit hole, and like I try to find like and I've made it a game with myself to figure out like how non-specific I can get and still get them stronger when they go back to the competition lift. And that's why I kind of think the idea of specificity is bullshit, because I have had people do some fucking stupid shit and they still got stronger. And why? Because they progressed from lighter to heavier over time and they increased their skill with movement, right? And so, like a good example is like, Paul used to program me like cat squats, right? And so, in an off season, like the off season before I squatted that 716 in sleeves, the heaviest I ever went, I did a 5x5 at 475 high bar beltless in 10 minutes. And then I squatted 716 in a knee. And then I like extrapolated that out and I was like, okay, that's like, 60% or whatever. I'm going to do that on deadlifts, and I run that for 2 mesocycles. And then like, because they increased their skill with the lift, and their first mesocycle, the deadlift started at 60%. And the second mesocycle, they started at 65%, and they did 8 sets of 5. And we reduced their rest over the period of time. So like increased density, and it forced them to get really, really good at the skill of deadlifting, even though the load was very light. The average PR when I run a 2 mesocycle thing with that is like 45 pounds in their deadlift. And these aren't shitty deadlifters, right? It's like, they'd go from like 620 to 655 or, 615 to 640, like whatever it ended up being. And it's just like, that's kind of why I think the whole thing is a little bit fucking stupid, because it's like getting someone strong is really fucking easy. You just have them do something for a while, and it's lighter at the beginning and heavier at the end. And they work on the thing that they suck at, whether that be positioning or whatever it ends up being, right? And so, that's kind of the end of my rant there, is just like, it's not fucking hard. Like, at some point you have to be like, all right, like I'm good enough as a coach that like, if they come back to low bar squats 4 months later, like they'll probably remember how to low bar squat. And if they can't, then maybe I didn't lay that pattern down strongly enough when they first had exposure to it.
Yeah, no, very good points. You have anything
you could just as easily like, so like within what Stu's saying, like you could easily implement infrequent exposure to the competition lift along the way to find that happy medium point. So like, sure. I've done it both ways. I've done squatting every week, low bar, had great skill. Like the first time I ever squatted 800, the heaviest I ever went in off season was 455. I squatted 800. So I'm not going to, but I was squatting every single week. So my skill of squatting was good. Then I've squatted 850 in the gym, and I only squatted once in the off season of like 16 weeks before meet prep. So I've done it both ways. Now I'm trying something in the middle. And the reality is this might work too. So far it's been quite good. And over time, you'll find that optimal frequency. The key is knowing, like, I think we did a really good job today of communicating, like, best case scenario based on the research and based on like what makes the most sense. Specificity is what you're going to want, but introducing nuance and saying, well, on the other end of the spectrum, you could do these things too and still get stronger. The reality is your specific intervention is going to be somewhere in the middle because of all the nuance associated with each individual.
Yeah, well, that's a good way to wrap it up. Stu, appreciate you coming on the show, man. Thank you for presenting your case and going over everything. It's greatly
Absolutely.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you for having me.
Yeah, of
Enjoy
course.
your vacation.
I will.
All right, guys, till next time, we'll catch you next week on the Coach's Corner.